The most dangerous moment in a human life is not when you are weak, but when you finally refuse to be weak any longer. Carl Jung knew this. He warned that the empath, the soft soul, the giver, the one who absorbs pain, does not remain endlessly pliant. There comes a day, sudden and silent, when something inside them fractures, and that fracture is not collapse, it is birth. For decades, Jung's case files were filled with what he called emotional shock absorbers of the family system. They were the daughters who apologized for existing, the sons who carried the moods of their fathers, the spouses who smiled through betrayal. They endured, they absorbed, they believed their sensitivity was weakness. But Jung saw what others did not. He wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And for the empath, acceptance means discovering that their sensitivity is not fragility at all. It is a weapon waiting to be forged. The break always comes the same way. Not in screaming, not in chaos, but in clarity. The empath finally sees that every time they said yes when they meant no, they were abandoning themselves. Every time they absorbed rage, grief, or manipulation, they were becoming a container for other people's shadows. And then, often after betrayal, often after the deepest wound, the clarity arrives. Jung called this moment the enantiodromia, when a thing turns into its opposite. The endless giver becomes the sovereign chooser. The one who lived to heal others begins to heal themselves. What family and lovers once mistook as softness crystallizes into a kind of unbreakable steel. And those around them? They feel it immediately. Predators sense it in their bones. Narcissists feel the ground shift beneath them. Jung documented it again and again. Manipulators avoid the awakened empath like vampires avoid sunlight. Because the break does not destroy the empath, it destroys the system that fed upon them. This was Jung's most unsettling realization, that the gentlest souls, once awakened, do not return to silence. They become what he called psychologically immune. No argument hooks them, no guilt binds them, no projection sticks. They see, and because they see, they cannot be deceived again. This isn't collapse, it is metamorphosis, and it begins with the break. Jung uncovered something chilling in his private notes, something so disturbing that he hesitated to publish it. He saw that empaths were not merely gentle souls unlucky in love or family. They were combatants in a hidden war they themselves did not recognize. He called it the war of projections, a battle fought not with weapons, but with emotional energy. Here is what he observed. Empaths were systematically drained by people who seemed to need healing most. These were not obvious predators. They appeared charming, even broken, wounded birds begging for rescue. But Jung noticed a deeper mechanism. These individuals had unconsciously learned to survive by feeding on the emotional light of others. He wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, but in these cases, something far darker was happening. The parasite projected emptiness outward and convinced the empath that depletion was devotion, exhaustion was love. Jung documented 4 stages of this parasitic process. Recognition of the light. The predator senses the empath's glow instantly, like a moth drawn to flame. The wound display. They approach not with demands, but with pain, trauma stories designed to hook compassion. Activation of empathy. The empath, unable to resist, pours out energy. Normalization of depletion. Exhaustion is reframed as proof of love, and the empath accepts the role of host. This was the hidden war. It wasn't waged with fists, but with guilt, pity, and manipulation masquerading as intimacy. And the cost was catastrophic. The empath's very life force was siphoned into others' unresolved shadows. But Jung went further. He saw that this dynamic wasn't random, it was archetypal. The empath embodied the wounded healer, while the parasite embodied what he called the shadow devourer. Together they created what he described as a psychological vampire effect. The more energy you give, the darker their shadow grows. Think of the horror of this realization. The very gift that allowed a child to survive, reading every mood, absorbing every unspoken tension, became in adulthood the beacon that drew predators. Jung called this the gaslight of the unconscious. When someone's shadow convinces your consciousness that your intuition is the problem. And yet, this wasn't just tragedy. For Jung, it was initiation. He believed that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The empath's hidden war was not meant to end in perpetual victimhood. It was meant to force a confrontation with shadow. First the parasites, and then, far more terrifyingly, their own. This is why Jung said the empath's awakening is society's most dangerous event. Because when they finally stop fighting a war they never chose, they begin waging a new one against the unconscious itself. To understand how Jung came to these conclusions, we must look at one of his most unsettling cases, what he later referred to as the day the mask slipped. The patient appeared flawless, a young professional respected by peers, admired by family, always agreeable, always polite. He lived what Jung called the performance theater, where every move was calculated to maintain harmony, to avoid offense, to keep up appearances. He laughed at jokes that weren't funny, nodded at ideas he opposed, worked tirelessly to embody the role society demanded. But beneath the surface, something was rotting. Each unspoken truth, each swallowed emotion, each false smile formed layers of what Jung called persona identification, the mask that hides the true self. The breaking point came not in violence, but in silence. During a meeting, asked to defend a proposal he secretly disagreed with, he froze. His body refused to cooperate. His voice cracked, then vanished. He sat there unable to speak, while colleagues looked on. In that moment, the mask slipped. Jung described the aftermath with clinical precision. The man's hands shook, his chest constricted, his mind reeled with panic. He felt naked, exposed, fraudulent. But Jung saw something else. He saw the first honest signal of the psyche. This is not failure, Jung told him. This is revolt. The unconscious refuses to play the lie. The patient wept, not because he had lost status, but because for the first time he realized he had no idea who he was without the mask. His exhaustion, his anxiety, his hollow relationships, suddenly they made sense. He had not been living. He had been performing. Jung later wrote that when the persona cracks, two possibilities emerge: regression into deeper falsity or initiation into individuation. The mask slipping is not the end of the self. It is the beginning of the real self. What society calls a breakdown, Jung reframed as a breakthrough. The patient's silence was not weakness. It was the psyche demanding truth. Before we descend further, we need the language. Jung always warned, the psyche works in images, not abstractions. Without names, the forces at play remain invisible. With names, you can see them move within you. The persona. This is the mask you wear in society, the polished identity, crafted to win approval and avoid rejection. Jung called it the compromise between the individual and society. It is useful, but when it becomes the whole self, it suffocates authenticity. The shadow. Everything you disown, everything too shameful, too angry, too inconvenient to fit the mask. These rejected contents are not gone, they are stored in the unconscious. And as Jung discovered, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The shadow is both danger and potential. The complex. These are clusters of repressed emotions and ideas that form semi-independent personalities within you. Jung wrote that a complex behaves like a splinter psyche, complete with its own emotions, impulses, and worldview. When a complex is triggered, you do not act, you are acted through. Individuation. This is the crown of Jung's psychology, the lifelong process of integrating persona, shadow, and self into wholeness. Not perfection, not sainthood, but wholeness. He called individuation the privilege of a lifetime to become who you truly are. The Anima, Animus. Jung's terms for the contra-gendered archetype within you, the inner feminine in a man, the inner masculine in a woman. These figures mediate your relationship with the unconscious. To ignore them is to remain half-formed. To integrate them is to expand into fullness. Now you can see the terrain, a false mask, persona, its hidden counterweight, shadow, the forces that hijack you, complexes, and the distant horizon of wholeness, individuation. Why do we need these terms? Because when the break comes, when the mask cracks, these are the powers that surge into awareness. If you don't know their names, they feel like madness. If you do, they become a map. The mask never shatters without warning. It erodes, it tightens. It begins as a subtle dissonance, small betrayals of the self, accumulating like cracks in glass. Jung observed this countless times. The crack is not caused by one great blow, but by the relentless weight of contradiction. Consider the causal chain he mapped. First comes conflict. You think one thing, but you must say another. Second, cognitive dissonance. The nervous system holds two irreconcilable truths at once. Third, somatic alarm. The body tightens, the breath shortens, the heart pounds. Fourth, persona defense. The mask stretches tighter, smiling, nodding, pretending. And finally, visible misalignment. The body betrays what the mask cannot hide. Hesitation, tremor, collapse. The crack is born. Why does this process feel inevitable? Because Jung wrote, "What is not made conscious returns as fate." The repressed shadow builds psychic pressure exactly like steam in a sealed container. The more perfect the persona, the more explosive the eruption when shadow forces burst through. He saw this most vividly in what he called the perfect person problem. Individuals so flawless in manners, so socially adapted, that they seemed almost inhuman. They never slipped, never faltered. And then, without warning, they would erupt with destructive force. Jung likened it to a volcano. The longer the calm, the greater the eruption. But the crack is not chaos for its own sake. It is a revolt of the psyche against a false order. It is the unconscious refusing to serve a mask that no longer fits. Jung insisted this was not pathology but necessity. He called it the self-regulating tendency of the psyche. When adaptation becomes too rigid, the unconscious destabilizes it, forcing transformation. Think about it. Every breakdown you have ever endured carried the same pattern. Not random, not senseless, a chain. Because a truth was denied, therefore the shadow pressed forward. Because the mask was brittle, therefore it shattered under weight. Because the self demanded wholeness, therefore the false identity collapsed. The crack is terrifying, not because it is meaningless, but because it is inevitable. When the mask cracks, the psyche presents you with two roads. One leads back into illusion, the other into transformation. Jung called this the most decisive moment in a human life. Path A, remasking. Most choose this. They scramble to repair the mask. They patch the persona with apologies, excuses, frantic promises to do better. They double down on image management. But Jung warned that this path carries a hidden cost. Every repair thickens the mask. Every denial drives the shadow deeper. The person becomes more polished, but also more brittle. And as he observed, the more the persona is perfected, the more the shadow erupts in monstrous form. Remasking does not heal, it only postpones the inevitable. Path B, integration, a rarer choice, but the only liberating one. Here the individual resists the urge to patch the mask. Instead, they pause. They face the discomfort. They admit, "I do not know who I am without the mask." Jung called this moment a sacred threshold, the ego relinquishing control, and the deeper self beginning to speak. Integration is slow, humiliating, often painful, but it births wholeness. Jung used a stark contrast to explain it. He said, "This was not a public relations problem. This was a psychic pivot. The collapse of the mask was never about reputation. It was about reality, the false self dying so the authentic self could be born. This is why the crack is so terrifying. It feels like the end." But Jung reframed it as a beginning, because when the mask fails, the psyche finally has the chance to reorient toward truth. And so, the choice becomes clear. Either you stitch yourself back into the costume of perfection, or you step naked into the arena of authenticity. One path leads to exhaustion, the other to individuation. Jung knew the psyche cannot integrate truth while drowning in terror. The first task after the mask cracks is not philosophy, not therapy, not lofty reflection. It is containment. Stabilize the system. Anchor the body. He observed that when the persona collapses, the nervous system floods with primal signals, racing heart, shallow breath, trembling hands, spiraling thought. These are not enemies, they are alarms. But if left uncontained, they hijack consciousness, and the person mistakes physiological panic for existential annihilation. Jung's method was deceptively simple. Create somatic anchors that remind the body it is safe enough to face the psyche. Consider these practices. Breath regulation. 4 counts in, 7 counts hold, 8 counts release. This pattern, Jung noted, interrupts the loop of fear-driven respiration. The unconscious receives the signal. Survival is not immediately threatened. Cold boundary. A splash of cold water across the face or wrists. The sudden temperature shift resets the autonomic nervous system, pulling you out of psychic swirl into embodied presence. Ground contact. Feet firmly to the floor. Name 3 objects you see, 3 textures you feel, 3 sounds you hear. This anchors awareness in the present moment, where shadow cannot overwhelm you. 90-second surf. Neuroscience later confirmed what Jung intuited. Emotional surges crest and pass in about 90 seconds, if not fueled by thought. Instead of resisting the wave, ride it until it breaks. Why are these bodily rituals necessary? Because, as Jung insisted, the spirit cannot soar if the body remains in panic. The psyche will not reveal its truths to a host who cannot hold them. Containment is the gate. And so the paradox appears again. You do not stabilize in order to avoid the shadow. You stabilize in order to face it, because you cannot dialogue with the unconscious while you are hyperventilating. You cannot meet your hidden self while you are fleeing your own body. Stability is not escape. It is permission. It tells the psyche, I am strong enough to hear what you have hidden from me. Containment creates the container. Now the work begins. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The shadow is that darkness, the collection of all you have disowned, denied, repressed, or banished to the cellar of the psyche." Most people fear this stage because they mistake the shadow for evil. But Jung insisted the shadow is morally neutral. It is not the devil. It is unlived life. Anger you were not allowed to feel. Selfishness you were shamed for expressing. Sexuality condemned as impure. Intelligence mocked as arrogance. The shadow is not sin. It is survival. How, then, to approach it without collapse? Through what Jung called symbolic witnessing, naming the shadow without fusing with it. He gave patients carefully worded prompts that you can adapt now. What am I most afraid others will discover about me? What trait in others provokes my strongest disgust or judgment? If I stopped performing goodness, what impulses would surface? Write the answers, speak them aloud, notice the tremors that rise. These tremors are not danger, they are the shadow knocking. Jung also taught that the shadow often appears first through projection. You see it outside yourself before you dare admit it inside. The colleague you call arrogant may mirror your own repressed ambition. The lover you accuse of coldness may reflect your own disowned detachment. Recognizing projection is step one in reclaiming the shadow. And here, the anaphora strikes. You see the pattern, you sense the hunger, you feel the cost. The task is not to banish what you find, but to hold it in consciousness without fleeing. Jung called this holding the tension of opposites. You acknowledge, yes, I want to be kind, and I also want to be cruel. Yes, I long to nurture, and I also long to dominate. Both are true. To deny one is to empower it in the dark. To hold both is to begin integration. This is shadow contact without collapse, not identifying with the shadow, not disowning it, but letting it stand before you as part of you. As Jung wrote, the shadow is 90% pure gold. In the very traits you've condemned lie the strengths you most need. Your anger hides your boundary. Your selfishness hides your self-care. Your lust hides your creative fire. And so the practice is simple, but never easy. Stay in the room with your own darkness until the gold within it begins to gleam. Shadow contact alone is not enough. To remain only in reflection is to risk what Jung called inflation of the unconscious, drowning in visions without transformation. The psyche demands action. And the first actions are confession and boundary. Confession. Jung did not mean a religious rite, but a psychological necessity. Secrets rot the soul. He observed that when patients voiced even a fragment of their denied truth, first to themselves, then to one trusted other, psychic pressure released. A neurosis, he wrote, is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. Confession is the choice to suffer honestly, rather than in disguise. It might be as simple as, I am exhausted because I've been pretending to agree when I do not, or I am angry at you, though I have never said it. The words pierce the silence and the mask thins. Boundary. From confession flows boundary, the externalization of inner clarity. Jung insisted that individuation required a capacity to say no without collapse. The repressed shadow of selfishness is here redeemed. To draw a line is not cruelty, it is alignment. The script is spare. I will not promise what I cannot deliver. Or, I am no longer available for this pattern. No apology, no over-explanation. The boundary is its own justification. Why are confession and boundary paired? Because confession reclaims your truth, and boundary protects it. Without confession, boundaries become rigid walls. Without boundaries, confession dissolves back into performance. Together they mark the birth of what Jung called the moral fact of the individual, the recognition that your inner reality is valid enough to shape outer reality. And here, the causal chain emerges again. Because you confess, therefore you return to authenticity. Because you set boundaries, therefore your relationships recalibrate. Because you refuse to rejoin the lie, therefore the self strengthens. This is not about rejecting the world. It is about ceasing to reject yourself. Once confession is spoken and boundaries are drawn, a hollow silence often follows. Who am I, if not the mask? What remains when the roles are stripped away? Jung warned that this is the most perilous stage. The danger is rushing back into old costumes, dutiful child, selfless partner, flawless professional, because the void feels unbearable. But Jung insisted the void is not a failure. It is the womb of rebirth. Identity must be rebuilt, not on roles which are borrowed, but on values which are yours. He instructed patients to distill their lives into 3 verbs, 3 living principles that could outlast circumstance. For one, it was to serve, to learn, to create. For another, to speak, to heal, to build. These verbs become what Jung called the axis of individuation, the inner compass by which decisions are measured. Notice the difference. A role says, I am a manager, a caretaker, a spouse. A value says, I am one who creates, one who protects, one who reveals truth. Roles collapse when jobs end, when relationships dissolve, when masks fail. Values endure. Jung saw that when people aligned their choices with these inner verbs, the psyche calmed. Anxiety lessened, not because life grew easier, but because actions finally harmonized with the self. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And who you are is not a title. It is the rhythm of your deepest values expressed through flesh and time." Here lies another causal inevitability. Because you shift from roles to values, therefore exhaustion diminishes. Because you live from values, therefore relationships clarify. Because you hold to verbs instead of masks, therefore the shadow transforms into strength. Roles keep you fragile, values make you durable. Values proclaimed in silence are only the beginning. Jung observed that individuation is always tested in the crucible of relationship. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances, he wrote. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. Once the mask has cracked, every domain of life becomes a proving ground. Work. In the workplace, the old persona often reasserts itself. The impulse to over-deliver, to fawn, to seek approval returns. Here the test is simple but severe. Decline what violates your values. If your verbs are to serve, to create, to speak truth, then accepting a role built on flattery or deceit poisons the self. Jung saw patients who, after setting just one value-based refusal, found entire work cultures shifting around them. Because one boundary held, the system exposed itself. The team player mask dissolved into a clarified identity. Love. Romantic intimacy is the sharpest mirror. To confess your truth and set boundaries in love risks rejection. But Jung insisted that false harmony is a greater danger than authentic loss. He called it neurotic accommodation, the silent betrayal of self for the illusion of relationship. The field test here is radical honesty, speaking what you feel without dressing it in apology. Love that survives such honesty becomes real. Love that collapses was never love but projection. Friendship. Here the mask often lingers in its subtlest form, banter, gossip, surface loyalty. Jung noticed that as individuals individuated, they could no longer stomach friendships rooted in shared avoidance. They craved what he called growth bonds instead of trauma bonds. The test is whether you allow friendships to end without guilt when they no longer honor your values. Many patients feared loneliness, yet soon discovered that authenticity drew new allies, rare but real, who could stand the weight of their truth. In each arena, the same causal law operates. Because you act from values, therefore false bonds dissolve. Because false bonds dissolve, therefore true ones emerge. Because true ones emerge, therefore the self stabilizes. Jung warned, the world will test you not because it is cruel, but because it cannot help but demand proof. Every no is a declaration of who you are becoming. Every yes is a confirmation of who you already are. Jung insisted that every genuine transformation carries its own perils. The road from persona to self is not a gentle slope. It is a razor ridge. 3 dangers appear again and again in his notes, each one subtle enough to masquerade as progress. 1. Spiritual bypass. This is the temptation to use lofty language to escape real conflict. Jung warned that the ego loves nothing more than to disguise avoidance as enlightenment. A patient proclaims, "I have forgiven everyone," when in truth they are terrified of confrontation. Another insists, "All is love," while silently drowning in resentment. This bypass halts individuation because it paints over wounds rather than healing them. Jung's caution, what you resist not only persists, it grows. To bypass the shadow is to feed it. 2. Shadow inflation. Once contact with the shadow is made, some exalt it. They confuse honesty with cruelty, authenticity with license. They wield truth like a weapon. "I'm just being real," as they wound others with precision. Jung saw this repeatedly and called it identification with the shadow. Instead of integrating darkness, they wear it as a new mask. The danger here is becoming the very predator they once fled. 3. Persona 2.0, the subtlest trap of all. After rejecting the old mask, the psyche builds a new one, this time the authentic self costume. It is another performance, vulnerability displayed for applause, boundaries worn as a badge of honor. Jung warned that even authenticity can become a persona if it exists for recognition rather than reality. This danger is insidious because it flatters the ego. Look how whole I appear. But the self needs no advertisement. These 3 dangers prove the law of opposites. Because you escape one illusion, therefore another rushes in to take its place. The only defense, Jung taught, is vigilance. To confess continually, to test boundaries in silence, to ask again and again, am I serving truth or am I serving image? The dangers are real, but they are not fatal unless you mistake them for the destination. Jung observed that individuation is not a single event, but a lifelong tension. The mask will always whisper, "Put me back on." The shadow will always stir, "Use me unconsciously." To remain unbreakable, daily rituals are required, not as performance, but as psychological hygiene. Here are 5 that Jung's students and patients return to again and again. Silence window. Set aside 30 to 60 minutes each week with no input, no books, no screens, no conversation. Jung called silence the psychic laboratory, where unconscious material rises without censorship. Without silence, the mask grows back unnoticed. Honesty rep. Speak one difficult truth per week, no matter how small. I don't like this meal. That comment hurt. Each truth strengthens the muscle of authenticity. Jung observed that honesty practiced incrementally prevents the flood of unspoken resentment that once cracked the mask. Body check. Place attention on sensation before story. Is the chest tight? Is the stomach burning? Jung taught that the body is the first language of the unconscious. By listening here, you intercept shadow before it hijacks behavior. One sacred gnome each week, decline one request without excuse. The simple, "No, that doesn't work for me," reinforces psychological sovereignty. Jung saw that those who never practiced refusal inevitably collapsed into resentment or illness. Play practice. Engage in something purposeless, drawing, singing, walking in nature, without needing outcome. Jung called this the symbolic life, the bridge between unconscious and conscious. Without play, life hardens into duty. With play, it breathes. Why these? Because they enact a law of psychic economy. Because you practice silence, therefore truth surfaces. Because you confess in small doses, therefore you avoid eruptions. Because you protect the body, therefore the psyche feels safe to speak. Because you say no, therefore your yes regains meaning. Because you play, therefore the self renews. Jung believed maintenance was more vital than epiphany. The crack is dramatic, but the rituals are decisive, for without them, the mask will grow back, heavier than before. With them, the self remains unbreakable. Jung insisted that beneath every personal story runs an archetypal current. The individual's suffering is not random, it is myth enacted in flesh. To truly grasp the crack of the persona, we must see it archetypally. The mask belongs to the hero. The hero archetype lives to be admired. It seeks approval through conquest, sacrifice, perfection. The hero plays roles flawlessly, the dutiful son, the tireless worker, the loyal partner. But Jung warned that the hero is doomed to exhaustion. Why? Because the hero's worth always depends on an audience. Without applause, the hero collapses. When the mask cracks, the hero dies. This is not tragedy, it is initiation. For what emerges is the sovereign. The sovereign does not seek applause. The sovereign governs the self. Jung described individuation as the coronation of inner authority. The individual who has faced their shadow becomes a law unto themselves. not in arrogance, but in alignment with the self. The shift is profound. The hero asks, "Do they approve of me?" The sovereign asks, "Am I aligned with truth?" The hero sacrifices self for others. The sovereign gives to others from the fullness of self. The hero lives in performance. The sovereign lives in presence. This was Jung's paradoxical revelation. The death of the hero mask feels like failure, but it births the only presence that cannot be broken. Because you no longer live for image, therefore you are no longer fragile. Because you stand in truth, therefore the world cannot dismiss you. The crown of sovereignty is invisible, but others feel it. They sense a weight, a steadiness. Manipulators retreat. The authentic draw near. This is not charisma, it is alignment. Jung would say, the self has taken the throne. We began with the patient whose mask slipped in a single moment of silence. The young professional, paralyzed in a meeting, terrified that his life had collapsed. Now we return to him months later, transformed by confession, boundary, values, and sovereignty. He did not repair the mask. He allowed it to die. He confessed to colleagues that he had agreed out of fear, not conviction. At first, he feared dismissal. Instead, his honesty earned respect. What they once called reliability, they now called clarity. He drew boundaries at work. No more endless yes, no more apologies for limits. Some projects fell away, others aligned more deeply. His career narrowed, but his energy doubled. In love, he told his partner truths he had buried for years. The relationship staggered, then steadied on new ground. For the first time, intimacy was not performance, but presence. With friends, he released those who only valued his compliance. The circle shrank. But the ones who remained called him trustworthy in a way they never had before. Jung described this as the pivot from role-based to value-based living. The man was no longer the dependable one, but the sovereign one, not fragile, but unbreakable. And here is the paradox. What looked like collapse was foundation. What felt like loss was liberation. What seemed like the end of identity was the beginning of self. This is why Jung insisted that a breakdown, when faced consciously, is never an ending. It is the psyche's secret way of saying, now you may begin. Jung warned that psychology is never private. The world hangs by a thin thread, and that thread is the psyche of man. The crack of the persona, though lived by an individual, reverberates through culture. We live in an age of masks, digital personas curated for applause, corporate roles performed for survival, identities polished into commodities. Never has the world been more addicted to performance, and never has the unconscious been more restless. The breakdowns we now call burnout, depression, or anxiety are not merely medical conditions. They are cultural symptoms. They signal that the collective persona, our social mask of progress, productivity, and positivity, no longer fits. Just as the individual erupts when the shadow is denied, so too does society. Polarization, disinformation, epidemic loneliness. These are collective cracks. Jung believed that individuation at the personal level is the medicine for collective pathology, because when one person stabilizes their psyche, therefore families shift. Because families shift, therefore workplaces recalibrate. Because enough individuals reclaim their shadow, therefore the culture itself is forced to evolve. He called this the work of the cultural container, souls who, by integrating their own unconscious, become living vessels strong enough to hold society's chaos without collapsing into it. This is why your personal crack matters. It is not just your survival at stake, it is the psychic evolution of the whole. We began with the terror of the break, that shattering moment when the mask slips and the self feels exposed. We named it not collapse, but birth. Now we return to the paradox with deeper clarity. The danger was never that you broke. The danger was believing you had to keep wearing the mask. The catastrophe was never your silence. The The catastrophe was your endless performance. The threat was never weakness. The threat was refusing to build a relationship with your true strength. Because when the mask cracks, therefore the self speaks. Because the self speaks, therefore the shadow integrates. Because the shadow integrates, therefore you become unbreakable. Jung called this the individuation process, the privilege of a lifetime, and privilege carries responsibility, to live not for applause, but for alignment, to live not from roles, but from values, to live not in performance, but in presence. So here is the call. Identify your 3 verbs, your living values. Share them, name them, write them down. Then choose one promise you will no longer make for the sake of keeping peace. That is your first boundary. That is your initiation. The thin thread of the world is the psyche of each individual. Your transformation is not a private victory. It is cultural medicine. The mask has cracked. Do not repair it. Step through it. Become sovereign. Become whole. Become unbreakable.